I think that's everything. So James, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we can get started.
Okie doke. Okay, so it did not start yet. All right, should be okay now.
Yep, we can see.
So yeah, my name is James Montgomery. My advisor was Doug Miller, and this is my presentation on analyzing the impact of hurricane catastrophe on the communities of Tampa Bay. So just to go over a bit of an outline on my presentation, I'm going to start off by talking about my background, the background of my issue. Then I'm going to go over my hypothesis and other objectives for the study. Then we're going to talk a bit about my data sources, the methods, results, and finally we're going to end with a discussion on what I found. So a little bit of background on my issue. Hurricanes are a big issue, and they're going to continue to be a big issue for the coastal regions of the United States and elsewhere in tropical regions of the world. Here in the United States, it's the #1 contributor of disaster losses on a monetary basis. And as I'm sure everybody's seen in the news, year after year, we seem to be setting new records for dollar amount of losses for these storms. Going forward, it doesn't seem like it's going to be getting any better due to anthropogenic climate change. There has been seen to be some correlation between the rising temperatures of the oceans and an increase in storm events. It's somewhat unclear whether or not the storms are getting stronger, but it definitely seems that we're seeing more and more storms in recent years. One aspect of our culture here in the United States is coastal migration, and that's the tendency of our populations to want to move closer and closer to the coasts. And this just moves more people into harm's way when it comes to hurricanes and can also lead to higher losses. Now, while it's an issue for all coastal communities, it has been seen that it does affect certain communities more than others. One case in point was Hurricane Katrina, and this one received a lot of media coverage, and there was also a lot of public outcry because it was very visible about how disproportionately this was affecting some communities as compared to others. One particular study by Green and colleagues in 2013 found that there was higher damage in areas that were either poorer or had a higher minority population. And this higher damage was also exacerbated by lack of recovery response in these areas, either because there weren't enough resources to get to the people, or the people that lived there were less able to get into contact and let people know that they needed the resources. Now, my study area is the Tampa Bay region, and this incorporates 2 counties, Pinellas and Hillsborough, and they're both situated along Tampa Bay, and Pinellas also has a exposure to the Gulf of Mexico. These counties are home to very diverse communities. There's some more affluent areas, there's poor areas, and there's also a good mix of ethnicities throughout here. There's also a very high population density, especially in some of the more coastal areas, like Pinellas County in particular. The hydrography of the bay also lends it to be a bit more at risk for a hurricane, since there's no northern outlet on the bay. If a storm approaches from the south, all the water being pushed in has nowhere to go, and it can pile up, creating a very large storm surge. The area also is very low-lying. There's only a few areas of Pinellas County that get above 20 or 25 feet. So most of these areas are low and very at risk for water coming up from a storm surge. There's also some sensitive infrastructure in the area that we wouldn't want to get swamped out by flooding or damaged by the wind. A few of these is a coal-fired power plant in the western part of the Tampa Bay. And if this were to flood, there would be some risk of the coal slurries being emptied into the bay and causing some environmental problems. The goals of my project are to, one, simplify the method for loss estimation. I'm going to be using a lookup table method to derive my loss amounts. And this is in contrast to the general rule of using loss simulations based on mathematical formulas. I'm also going to be creating a community risk database. It's going to be based out of Postgres, which is an open source database program similar to SQL Server. It's free for anyone to use as long as you have an internet connection and a computer that's able to run it. The database is going to be multi-scale and multi-risk, so you can look at multiple breakdowns of the population, be it zip code, census block group, or as a whole county. It's also going to be multi-risk. It can take into account the flood damage or the wind damage at the same time or separately. Hopefully the data in this database is actionable for the stakeholders of the area, so they can go in and look and see which areas are either more likely to be affected by wind or surge, or find those areas that might be more vulnerable to slow recovery afterwards. I'd also like to test my hypothesis that certain areas that the damage is going to be correlative with the makeup of the populations, either in terms of income or race or ethnicity. To go over my data sources, I'm using Florida NAL data, which stands for name, address, and legal. And this is a parcel database that shows all real property in the state of Florida. For this study, I've only downloaded the two counties, Pinellas and Hillsborough, but it is available statewide. And it shows, like I said, the parcel data in terms of the shape of the parcel. And it also has some other data about the building on the parcel, such as what the building's made out of, how large it is, and the square footage. I am supplementing this database with a few county-based sources from property appraisers that give me a bit better idea of the exact value of the home, as well as some additional home details like what type of roof is on it, and how many stories the building has. Another data source is derived from the SLOSH model, and these are storm surge coverage maps. And I'll be using the maximum of maximum approach, which takes out the factor of the direction of the storm and just gives you a maximum value of flooding per cell for any given storm at the location. And this is going to be 5 outputs, categories 1 through 5. I'll also use a JRC flood damage factor table, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail about in a second, as well as a wind damage factor table, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more detail in a few minutes. I'll also be using US Census data in the form of block groups with American Community Survey data attached. And this is going to give me my income and ethnic diversity stats for the block groups. USGS DEM is going to be used to verify the SLOSH model to make sure that properties seen to be submerged are submerged. And also a terrain C region, which I created. And this terrain C region is showing areas that are more at risk to wind because they don't have any structures blocking the wind for them. So this is going to be the coastal areas within 1,500 feet of the coast. Okay, to talk a little bit about the flood damage factor table. This was developed by the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and they took global averages for flood losses for each of the main regions of the world. And the regions are generally correlating with the continents. So there would be a North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and so on. For my study, I used the North America region since my study area is in North America. And the North America region entails Canada and the USA. And like I said before, it calculates the average damage expected for each water depth event. And this is just, you just apply the damage factor to the value of the building, and that gives you the amount of damage that you should see from the given event. Now, the wind damage factor table is something that I created independently, just specifically for this study. I used a 2008 Florida hurricane loss report that was developed by the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation. It's based on hurricane loss data for insurance companies over the course of several events. I believe there were 6 major events that went into this study, and it did take into account the 2004-2005 hyperactive seasons that we saw. I derived the damage factors for loss relatives for different structure factors, and these loss relatives were derived in the study by isolating each factor of the home and comparing how much higher the damage or the claims amount was for homes seeing certain conditions. So for example, we take the first condition, the Florida Building Code, and after 2002, a new Florida Building Code was instituted that greatly increased the requirements for a home to withstand the impacts of wind. And so homes built after this were seen to have 20% less damage than those that were built before it. So my damage factor table shows a factor of 2 if you were built before 2002, so you would be seen to have 20% more damage. And I did this for each of the main attributes that I was able to find in the NAL data. So just to go over the processes that I used to analyze the data, the wind risk data analysis started off with the 3 independent factors, the census block groups, terrain region, and the building damage factors. The terrain region had to be done separately because it wasn't provided in the NAL data. I had to use a spatial join to get it from the region that I created. And so all 3 of these were joined together. So I would get the parcel data with all the wind risk factors attached to it. After I had that, I was able to use a simple if-then query to apply the factors to the building value and then sum them into a complete loss value. For the flood data analysis, there was a bit more that went into it in terms of a spatial analysis side, because everything besides the building values was separated. So, hold on a second. Okay. So I start off with my parcel data, and after I did some pre-processing, I intersected it with the slosh output. And this gave me the parcel data with a surge height for each parcel. I then conducted the zonal statistics to find the max value of elevation on each parcel. And it wasn't the absolute max. I went through and I took the the 2 standard deviations above the average. And that was just to weed out any, falsely high elevation values that might just be a tree or a power line, something else that got in there that shouldn't have been there. And then I used this elevation to calculate the surge depth, which could then be compared to the damage table to get the amount of the property that was expected to be damaged per flood. And then that could be joined to the census block groups so that I could compare it to income and ethnic data. And this is just an example of the slosh outputs. I mentioned that I had to verify the elevation of the flood event in the previous slide, and that was because some of these cells are quite large, and they get larger as they go from the center. So for example, for areas along the Pinellas County beaches, the cells could show a surge height of 12 or 15 feet, but the elevation at a specific point on there might be above it. So I wanted to make sure that I took those properties out so they didn't add a false positive to the results. And yeah, this is just going over a little bit more what I had shown on the previous slide. So to get into the results, flood exposure to Tampa Bay populations seemed to be highly correlated with the income level. As the income level increased, the amount of damage seen in that population group also increased. And for category 4 and 5, for the 10th percentile, both saw 100% damage. And this does fit with what we know about the area. For the Tampa Bay region, property values tend to increase as you get closer to the coast because, you know, it's a highly desirable area to live. So the higher income block groups, it makes sense that the higher income block groups are located on the coast and that they also saw the most damage because they're the most exposed to the storm surge. They're kind of like the first in line to get hit. Their higher loss ratios were also focused in less diverse communities. These communities along the coast were more likely to have a higher percent of white people in the population and a lower ethnic diversity. A similar case was seen with the wind exposure. There was another correlation between income level and the amount of wind damage. And this can just be seen a little bit in this table to the right, where you see the relationship to the median income. The above category is higher than the below category for both Pinellas and Hillsborough. And similarly to flood damage, the wind damage was seen to go down as the ethnic diversity increased. So just to discuss a little bit more, the coastal areas were hardest hit with the surge, and these areas had higher property values and higher incomes, and they were also less diverse. There was an area of south central Pinellas County that did have a high degree of ethnic diversity and also lower incomes, but still saw significant damage. And this would be one of the areas that if this was presented to a stakeholder, you might point out that, you know, these certain areas, either zip codes or census block groups, might be ones where you should plan on having extra resources available after the storm, just to make sure people's homes could be rebuilt and you know, nobody is left behind. For the wind exposure discussion, I found that the main driver of the increase in damage amounts was the terrain region. And this is likely because it was situated around the coast, and that's why we saw a higher degree of damage to the higher income and less diverse areas. Some of the other features that I thought would play more into you know, the inland areas, such as the roof material and the building code, they tended to cancel each other out because the older homes tended to have shingle roofs, whereas newer homes had tile roofs. And the increase in damage seen on tile roofs canceled out the fact that, or the decrease in damage seen on tile roofs compared to, or on shingle roofs compared to tile roofs, sorry, getting those mixed up, canceled out the building code. So even though those homes were newer, since they had tile roofs, the damage was essentially flat. I wasn't able to analyze roof shape and opening protection, which were provided in the 2008 loss report. And I feel as though if these were incorporated into the study, we might see a bit more of just a bit more damage on the more interior sections, because these older homes are also less likely to have the hip roofs, which are more resilient than the gable roofs. And that might help to, you know, kind of break that tie that we were seeing between the building code and the roof material. And this is a bivariate map that I created just to show the difference between wind damage and the median income. And as you can see, you know, for the most part, the coastal regions are in kind of that mid damage level, but high income. And there are a few in Tampa Bay where it is a bit more, the population's a bit more evenly spread in terms of income and race. There are some areas that you can see both lower income and high damage. So to conclude, loss ratios generally correspond to demographic groups, though not in the way that I expected. I expected it to be similar to that study that I had cited earlier, where lower income and more diverse communities were potentially more at risk. For the Tampa Bay region, it seems that higher income and less diverse communities are at higher risk for at least amount of the damage. In the future, additional data points could improve the accuracy for the wind analysis. As I noted, you know, I wasn't able to bring in wind or roof shape, which I think is going to be one of the bigger factors if the data could be found. And just to add a little bit of grain of salt, even though the you know, the normalized data showed that higher income and less diverse areas were receiving a large degree of the damage after these storm events, that doesn't necessarily mean that the lower income areas are out of the woods. It could be that these areas have a less prominent insurance coverage rate, which could hinder them recovering after an event. And also we need to consider financial circumstances. The lower income areas might not have as robust savings, so they might not be able to bounce back as immediately as some of these higher income areas. And these are my works cited, and I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, if anybody has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat there.
Okay, so somebody, Ryan asks, I may have answered this, but can I remind you how you measured damage? Is it a total dollar amount or a percentage of some sort? He asked because it seems like he found damage correlated with income, which may simply be that properties that are damaged are worth more. So everything was normalized. So for example, the wind damage, I took a base 10% damage for each home value, but then that was normalized back to the total total property value for the entire census block. So this, the output is a percent of the total value of each census block, which was damaged. So that helps normalize it out and make it, you know, less of an impact of those higher income areas and higher property values overshadowing the lower property value areas. And that was really important because it was a thought early on that, you know, just because an area is, you know, has more property value there, I didn't want it to, you know, kind of just overshadow everything else. So I did normalize everything by, you know, damage divided by property value. Okay, Kyle asked, have I been able to quantify the order at which storms are getting worse over time? That wasn't really something that I went into with this. I didn't study past storms and you know, how the strength has been increasing or decreasing. It's a bit anecdotal. So the strength of the storm, there's a lot of factors that go into it, and that's part of the reason why why the studies that I found haven't come out and said, you know, as the earth warms, the storms are going to get stronger. They were just, they were able to show that as it's been warming, we've been seeing more and more storms. And Sarah asks, what other types of applications or fields would this analysis be useful for? So disaster planning is the #1 thing that I think this would be useful for. Part of the reason that there was, such a quagmire after Hurricane Katrina is there wasn't a whole lot of planning before the storm happened as to what they needed to do and what communities they needed to send people out to or send money to. And this kind of just led them to, kind of throw the kitchen sink at it, and it didn't necessarily work. So this would be, perhaps the mayor of Tampa could look at it and say, we have these 2 zip codes, which, might potentially be underserved after an event. So maybe we need to plan to make sure we have, 1 person in charge of making sure everything that they need gets taken care of. I hope that answers that question. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sarah. All right, and I think that's all for the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Great job.
Thank you.
And Layla, if you want to go ahead and share yours, you can get started when you're ready.
Okay, so I'll get started. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone had a good holiday. My name is Leela Work, and my project is modeling stream temperature of the Salmon River using climatic variables and water temperature loggers. And my advisor is Dr. Andrew Carlton. As an overview for my presentation, I'll start with a little background about my project and study area, go into detail about my data, my methods, results, and wrap things up with my conclusion. Background. My study area is the Salmon River and is located in central Idaho. It runs approximately 684 kilometers starting in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness area, which is the largest roadless area in the country. The Salmon River is one of the largest rivers in the continental United States without a single dam on its main stem. It flows into the Snake River and west to the Pacific Ocean. The Salmon River is home to many aquatic species and fish, including Chinook salmon, steelhead, sockeye salmon, cutthroat trout, bull trout, rainbow trout, Pacific lamprey, mountain whitefish, smallmouth bass, squawfish, sucker, and sturgeon. Of these, Chinook salmon, steelhead, and bull trout are listed as threatened, and sockeye salmon are listed as endangered. I went into more detail about the Salmon River and salmon in my proposal presentation, so to save on time, I'm going to move along, but it is important for you to know that aquatic species are especially sensitive to increasing water temperature, which is the driving motivation for my project. In my GEOG 587 class, which was Conservation GIS, I ran a pilot study for my capstone project. My study area was reduced to Cape Horn Creek, which is circled in the image on the right, which is a small stream near the Salmon River in the Idaho wilderness, to test out my methods and see if this project was something that was actually going to work. I used observed water temperature data from October 2010 through mid-September 2015 for nearly 5 years of consecutive data. I limited my analysis to 2 variables and looked at snow water equivalent and solar radiation. This project gave me good results and showed promise to mirror this project for my capstone, which brings me to my data. For my capstone project, I chose to look at 4 variables, the first being snow water equivalent, also known as SWE. This data is SNODOS data and came from the Climate Engine website. My next variables I looked at were mean air temperature and mean precipitation, which both are PRISM data and also came from the Climate Engine website. My fourth and final variable I analyzed was solar radiation data derived from the solar radiation tool in ArcGIS. My stream temperature data came from Idaho Department of Fish and Game and is from water temperature loggers set to record data at an hourly interval. I obtained my water data from 11 different sites, which I reference as SR1 through SR11 throughout my presentation. SR1 through SR8 water temperature loggers were installed in August 2015 and recorded stream temperature through August 2020. Sites SR9 through SR11 were installed in 2016 and recorded stream temperature data through August 2020. The water temperature loggers span approximately 225 kilometers between the most upstream logger and the most downstream logger. For reference, Cape Horn Creek, the stream I used for my pilot project, was only about 14 kilometers. This next slide shows the locations of all 11 water temperature loggers. As you can see, the loggers are not in numerical order because sites 9, 10, and 11 were added a year after the others. This order is important for you to know for later slides as I stick to an upstream to downstream order in my analysis. The watersheds I used for my project are as follows. Here is SR1, SR2, SR3, SR11, SR4, SR5, SR10, SR6, SR7, SR8, and SR9. This shows all of the watersheds separately to give you an idea of the smallest to largest watersheds. I ended up omitting a few sites due to data discrepancies, including water temperature loggers being buried in substrate and technical difficulties. So SR2, SR11, and SR5 were omitted for the remainder of the analysis. This brings me to my methods. I started out by downloading my climate data, snow water equivalent, air temperature, and precipitation from the Climate Engine website for every 2-week period over the course of the 5 years of stream temperature data. Then I processed this data in ArcGIS where I clipped all 400 dataset files to each watershed polygon. I averaged the stream temperatures in Excel to mirror the same 2-week periods and calculated the mean for all of my stream temperature data. I ran the solar radiation tool in ArcGIS to obtain solar radiation averages for each month of my data. Once I had my mean solar radiation values, mean snow water equivalent data, mean air temperature data, mean precipitation data, and mean observed stream temperature, I was able to write code in RStudio to analyze and process my data. I started out creating a correlation matrix for my variables to see if any of my variables correlated too much. I found that my air temperature and my solar radiation variables were very closely correlated as their correlation coefficient was over 0.7 at 0.86. This means they both should not be used in a model together. So to prevent my model from overfitting my stream temperature data, I ran univariate models with my air temperature and solar radiation variables to see which one is a better predictor of water temperature. From this table, you can see that air temperature has a lower AICC, which means it does a better job predicting water temperature when compared to solar radiation. So based on my univariate model, I chose to get rid of my solar radiation variable for the remainder of my analysis. Next, I ran a multivariate linear model for each SR site using every combination of my predictor variables using 1, 2, or 3 variables for each model, creating 7 models per SR site. I then looked at my AICC, which is meant to be used to compare models with a small sample size and penalizes models of increased complexity. This weighed all of my models against each other to find my top model for each SR site. I used the model that had the lowest AIC value. In my case, all of my top models for each SR site had a model weight of greater than 0.5. So I chose to use my top model for each of my SR sites and did not conduct model averaging. After looking at the AICC for each of my sites, I was able to find my coefficients for each of my models, and it was really interesting to look at them in this table as I have them from upstream to downstream. And you can see that all of my coefficients for each of my variables are very similar. Also, this table shows how influential mean air temperature is on stream temperature, as it was used as a coefficient in each of my models. Continuing this table, I ran models with all of my 2018 data omitted so I could use my 2018 data for validation. The best fitting model for this set of data used snow water equivalent, mean air temperature, and mean precipitation. The same variables were used when I ran models including all of my data but omitting SR1, the smallest area, or SR9, the largest area, so I could use this data for validation. This was interesting to see that the more data included in the models, the more variables were utilized. Interestingly, regardless of what data I excluded from my model for validation, my model coefficients remained nearly the same, which is a good sign that these bottom three models are good predictors of stream temperature. Again, I left out mean solar radiation to it being too closely correlated to air temperature. On to my results. This is what my model looks like for SR1. I'm trying to see how well my variables predict my observed stream temperature data by using this equation. The 5.5049070 is my intercept. Then I added that to negative 0.0015485 times my SWE data and added that to 0.6350087 times my air temperature data. This resulted in a predicted water temperature value, and I ran this equation for each of my 2-week time periods. As you can see, my R-squared value is real close to 1, which shows that my model works very well at predicting my observed water temperature. The graph on the right graphs my observed water temperature to my predicted water temperature, and as you can see, they are very close. I did this for each of my sites using the best fit model for each site, and they are as follows. SR3 also used snow water equivalent and air temperature as variables. SR4 through SR10 all only use air temperature in their models, but still did a good job predicting the observed stream temperatures, and all have a near one-to-one relationship with a high R-squared value. As I mentioned earlier, I ran all of my data in one model, but omitted SR1, so I could go back and test my model on the SR1 data. This model used SWE, air temperature, and precipitation data. These graphs show the testing of the top model created using all of my data except the SR1 data. They modeled performance based on my SR1 validation data. As you can see, my model did a good job predicting my validation data. This data tells us that snow water equivalent, air temperature, and precipitation combined do a good job modeling stream temperature. Similarly, I did the same thing for SR9, omitting it from the training data. And then testing my model on the SR9 only data. This model also used snow water equivalent, air temperature, and precipitation, and does a good job predicting my validation data. So this tells us that this model works on smaller areas such as SR1, which is our most upstream watershed, and much larger areas such as SR9, which is our most downstream watershed. Next, instead of omitting a sample site, I omitted a whole year of data from each of my sites and randomly chose to omit year 2018. This created another model using snow water equivalent, air temperature, and precipitation, which, as you can see in this graph, does a great job predicting my 2018 validation data. I graphed site SR1 for 2018 using the same model to show how well the model predicts my validation data. And I did the same for SR9 as well. For both sites, the model works really well. This model would be the one I would use on other streams to estimate water temperature. This model does have limitations though. There would be a measure of uncertainty if the stream I were to use for my model on, had data outside the range of the data that was used to build this model. For example, if the stream I was using it on had mean air temperatures far below negative 12.5 degrees Celsius or far above 19.4 degrees Celsius, then there would be increased uncertainty in the stream temperature results. Also, this model was created in the Salmon River area, so applying it to other regions, such as in Washington State, could result in additional uncertainty. Conclusion. I was able to model stream temperature using snow water equivalent, air temperature, and precipitation with this model. The project is a good example of using remotely sensed data to model an abiotic factor that is important for aquatic species. My model could be used with predicted snow water equivalent, air temperature, and precipitation values with some margin of error. With my model and projected increasing air temperature due to climate change, my model shows stream temperature following the same increasing trend, which will have a negative impact on some fish species, such as salmon and trout, as well as other aquatic species in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Andrew Carlton for being my advisor and for his support, Beth King for all her guidance and help throughout my time here at Penn State, Brent Beller from Idaho Fish and Game for allowing me to use the stream temperature data he collected, the folks from Desert Research Institute and the University of Idaho who run the Climate Engine website, NOAA Fisheries for employing me while I was going to school, and all of the Penn State faculty who have educated me and mentored me over the last couple of years. Thank you for your time, and now I will open it up for any questions you may have. I can't see the, oops. Okay, yeah, asks if I have a specific audience or organization in mind that may be interested in this analysis. Yes, definitely. I actually plan to write up a summary of my analysis and send it to Brent Beller, who was so kind to let me use his stream temperature data. So, you know, state agencies and federal agencies that are looking at stream quality and monitoring fish, I think this would be very important for them to know. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work that's put into monitoring water quality for fish species. So any agency that does that type of work could use this for sure.
Any other questions? Thanks, Layla.
Thank you.
We will move on to Kyle. Kyle, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right, let's see. Y'all see everything okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. Well, hi, my name is Kyle Souter. My project is What Drives Place-Based Development in Maryland, an examination of 1980 to 2020. My advisor is Dr. Stephen Matthews. So here's an overview of my presentation. I'll start by giving a background on the state of Maryland. Then I'll highlight some of the features of the topography, as well as some factors that can increase rural development. And then I'll go over the goals and objectives of the project and share my results. So an overview of Maryland, there's pretty much a little bit for everyone. There's everything from beaches to farmland. There's plenty of rural farmland on both the east and west sides of the state. This is actually a photo I took from my front yard this morning. There's plenty of urban areas as well. Downtown areas include Baltimore, Annapolis, Silver Spring, and Frederick, just to name a few. Between these mini metro areas are mainly filled with more dense suburban areas, intertwining streets. And while much of the growth has appeared organically over time, there's pockets of communities will pop up, such as this one in Lake Linganore. It's a growing suburb outside of Frederick, Maryland. And the draw factor here is the waterfront properties of the man-made lake. Which, fun fact, Maryland is the only state that does not have a natural lake. They are all man-made. In between the suburban patches, you'll find more rural areas with a lot of state and local parks scattered in between. And then off to the west, there are pieces of the Appalachian Mountains. So to summarize again, there's pretty much something for everyone. And we get all the seasons, especially the snow sometimes. And with all this in close proximity to two major metropolitan areas, both Baltimore and Washington, D.C., while I wouldn't recommend it, you can commute to downtown from anywhere in the state. The objective of this project is to identify three main factors that coincide with the development of once rural areas. Then we'll recognize the areas in Maryland that contain population growth over the state average. And then we'll demonstrate how these contributors are affecting these areas. So the three factors I decided to focus heavily on were employment, housing, and transportation. I believe that these three are so closely related and dependent on each other that they can give us the best picture of population change. Also, they can be quantified using mostly existing data. So why? When choosing where to live, what influences your decision? Is it the cost? Is it the commute times? Is it the environment? Or is it all the above? Also, when choosing a job, what influences that? Is it the field that you're working in? Is it the commute times? Does the job come first, or does the house come first? Some people move to a particular area, then choose a job. Others live there based on where they work. It's kind of tough to quantify that. Kind of like the chicken or the egg problem. So tying these two together is transportation, which is my third factor here. What infrastructure is in place to facilitate the movement between home and work? What roads, what commuter rails, and how do the capacities of these infrastructure elements change over time? So many of these population movements and growths can occur naturally. However, this is not always the case. Across the country, as well as in Maryland, there are areas of what is called transit-oriented development. It's where the state provides incentives provided to businesses and new residential communities located near major transit hubs. So if you picture like a large outdoor-based complex with restaurants, shopping, and apartments, those will usually be based by your major rail hubs or light rail systems or bus depots. Maryland has specific programs targeted at improving this type of development near its new and existing rail stations, and there's about 120 of them currently in the state of Maryland. Baseline population growth. This is a chart that displays the annual population growth for both the United States as well as the rest of the world's quote unquote higher income countries or first world countries. You'll notice that while there is some variation there is a general trend, and they mostly remain consistent with one another between 0.5% and 1.5% per year. So adding in the gray line, which is Maryland's population growth year over year, you can see there's a few times where the growth rate rises to double the national average and 3 times the global average. So during years 1987 and 2000, these spikes are kind of areas of interest, and I'd like to see how these trends fit in to the global population growth. So the overall population gain for the state of Maryland between 1980 and 2019 was from 4.2 to about 6.1 million. That's about a 50% gain in population. So the first factor I discussed was employment. Federal and state government jobs are the largest employer in Maryland currently. And while manufacturing jobs that were once plentiful in the 60s and 70s sort of begin to fade away to other parts of the country and the world, jobs in the professional services industry climbed. This combination led to a more educated workforce, and as a result, the employment rate will either need to maintain or generally improve over the course of this time frame for each tract identified. A reduction in employment rate is not really considered a positive sign of development, so in future studies, this could be applied to help identify areas of decline, as those are important to recognize as well. Many of these government positions are located both in and surrounding Washington, D.C., allowing Maryland to be a great option for commuting workers. And this chart demonstrates the general stability that the labor market in Maryland has had over the last 40 years. So with consistent growth and only minor jumps of unemployment during major nationwide economic events, this amounts to around a 65% increase in eligible workers in labor force, and that comes out to a 40-year unemployment average around 5%. So the second factor I looked at was median housing values. So in order to do this, I selected 5 different census tracts that fell into each category that you see here in the chart, and I averaged their results. So for example, I chose 5 tracts that were what I believe to be in a rural population density, and I took their median housing value at 1980 and adjusted it for inflation in the year 2000, which during that time is about 109% for those 20 years, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So then using the value of the same tract for the year 2000, I calculated the average percent change in the median household value over the 20-year span for those 5 tracts. I found that the rural and suburban neighborhoods that remained both rural and suburban respectively, they saw a gain anywhere between 31 and 35% on average. So about a 1.5% and 1.75% sort of gain every single year. While households that like jumped up in population density, say they went from rural to suburban or suburban to urban, they were going up anywhere between 43% for suburban and 53% for rural homes that became suburban. So that was after adjusting for inflation. So for future studies, I found that urban areas that were unimproved and saw an increase in crime and unemployment fell by nearly the same amount that the others improved upon on average, which is around 38%. So again, this could be for future studies, this could be a way that we recognize areas that are in decline that need additional assistance and resources. So as population increases, the infrastructure needs to continually improve and expand to keep up with demand. And as a result, Maryland has added numerous additional state and interstate freeway segments since 1980. This includes the continuation of I-95 through Baltimore to DC and the construction of the Fort McHenry Tunnel, as well as the continuation of 695 and the construction of the Francis Scott Key Bridge to complete the Baltimore Beltway. For rail networks, this includes the MARC train, which is a commuter rail service that links Baltimore and DC. This allows commuters to live in Baltimore and work in DC and vice versa. The Baltimore Metro Rail and the DC Metro system. And again, there's over 120 different commuter rail stations in the state of Maryland currently. So this is a basic outline of where these improvements and expansions have taken place since 1980. As you'll see shortly, they're mainly in areas that already have undergone development, and therefore they're more likely a result of previous rural development in the 50s and 60s and 70s rather than a cause of new development that will come later. So one symptom of increased development is that it puts a strain on the existing infrastructure. For roadways especially, this is pretty easy to quantify. It comes in the form of increased average traffic volumes and congestion. So this map, this just highlights some sections of roadway that have more than 4 lanes or 2 lanes in each direction that saw at least a 15% increase in traffic volumes over the latest 6-year period of 2012 to 2018. So freeways and divided highways are built for and can handle these increased volumes to an extent before it's noticed by commuters. The lack of 4-way intersections and traffic signals allow people to keep moving at a decent pace. However, on smaller or local roads and feeder routes that are 1 to 2 lanes, increased volume can drastically affect commuting times. So this graphic kind of displays all the roads, including local ones, that saw an increase of at least 15% in traffic volume over the same time period. So before we move on to population, we can already kind of anticipate which areas are going to be more densely populated. It's going to be the areas around DC, Baltimore, and Frederick, kind of that areas that are experiencing these congestion in these local roads. So here's the population density for the area of 1980. As you can see, the area starts off pretty densely populated around the city centers, around surrounding DC, a little bit in Frederick and Hagerstown, as well as in Baltimore City. But the area that you want to look at is kind of northeast or northwest of Baltimore, and how it stays mostly rural. A lot of those census tracts are still very sparsely populated, less than 1 person per square mile. But moving on to 2010, you can see how much these areas in between the cities has begun to fill in and develop. If I switch back and forth here, you can clearly see how everything kind of fills in there. So now the point of this project is to be able to identify these areas and attempt to predict what influences development. So in order to combine all 3 of these factors that I brought up previously, employment, housing, and transportation, I'll make a selection based on the following criteria. So if we look at parcels that only have a population density that increases more than the state average for the time period, as well as look at median home values for the tract that have to increase by at least 40% after adjusting for inflation, because remember, we talked about how communities that went from being rural to being light suburban or suburban, they increased by anywhere between 45 and 53%. So we're looking for at least 40% gain there. The tract also must have direct or vicinity access to a roadway which has had its average daily traffic increase by at least 15%. And also the unemployment rate for that census tract also must not decrease, because again, that is not a good sign of development, and so the unemployment rate must not go down. So seeing the results, we can see the selection we made has identified census tracts that were once rural, but is now closer to being classified as suburban. There are also tracts that would be ideal commuter locations for some of the top employers by volume in the state. And so essentially, we can use this, future developments on this project can be used to utilize existing and additional factors to try and anticipate where the next round of rural development will take place. This will hopefully assist local and state agencies as well as commercial enterprises to be more proactive in infrastructure expansion and planning, rather than being reactive to previous spikes in rural development. So I'd like to open it up to any questions if there's time. If not, thank you for your time. Again, future plans of the project, if I were to continue this in my free time, would be most likely putting together some sort of web service to bring in data from more sources and identify more quantifiable factors. I could also use the reverse of some of these factors to identify areas of decline. My advisor, Stephen Matthews, made a great point that development such as this is not always great everywhere, and that there's winners and losers. And there appears that there's not always allocated resources that they need to be prosperous, and we need to be able to address that. there any questions? Stop sharing.
Questions, please put them in the chat. We have a question there from Leah.
All right, Leah, so what are some lessons I learned during the capstone? Mainly is that it's finding data for this project was probably the hardest part, especially since finding consistent data all from the same source. I found the main gap between historical data and data from recent years was mainly between 2000 and 2010. A lot of the main data sets used for like median housing values and things like that came grouped from 2000 and before. And then a lot of the more recent sets were either from like the mid 2000s on into the present. So I think being able to find consistent data that used either on the tract level or on the county level to remain consistent was probably the biggest challenge. And I think going forward, I'd probably try to find more quantifiable metrics in order to try to predict the census tracts that would provide more rural development.
Okay, thanks very much, Kyle. Great job. If anybody has any more questions, you could see that Anthony posted the link to Slack. So there's a way to kind of continue this conversation there. So maybe if you have a question but didn't have a chance to type it in, you could head there. If you just scroll up in the chat history there, that link is there.
Yeah, Peter, I'll address your question in Slack.
Oh.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. Thanks. Okay, so the next person is Peter. So Peter, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking about improving the FCC rural broadband reporting with speed test data. My name is Peter Amico. My advisor is Michelle Zeters. So let's just get started. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to speak to you today about my efforts to improve the FCC's rural broadband reporting by pairing their coverage-based reporting maps with speed testing data. You know, when I first was starting to talk about this subject back in my 2019 596A class, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if I could come up with an example or two that would really convince everyone just how necessary broadband is in everyday life, and how living without it could put you at a great disadvantage? You know, how a time might come that we might all depend on, even require the kind of reliability, access, and feeds that broadband can bring to a household, and that families without it could face significant disadvantages like children falling behind in school, parents losing access to job opportunities, or even worse, not being able to work at all, examples like that. You know, I thought back then in those rosy 2019 days, it would really be great if everyone could understand how necessary a broadband connection might be, you know, at a deeply personal level, wouldn't it? So anyways, now that I've probably triggered some deeply traumatic memories in a few of you, let's look on the bright side. Many of you probably live in an urban area and probably have at least one, maybe even 2 or 3 broadband providers to choose from. Urban areas typically are the first to reap the benefits of new technology, such as broadband, 4G, 5G, and why not? These are typically densely populated areas that are already wired for fiber optics, making them prime targets for telco companies to reap a large return on their investments. Now, nearly 80% of the country's population live in these urban areas, even though they account for only about 3% of the land area. You can see that in the map there. The urban areas are in red, with the rural areas in gray there. But what about the rest of the 97% of the country and the 20% of the population that lives in these areas? Historically, they lag behind in technology, existing in huge internet deserts where your options may be severely limited. Rolling out broadband to these areas has been a very difficult process. So why is rural broadband so difficult? Yeah, I don't want to get too bogged down into the details. I covered this a lot in my 596A presentation, but basically it boils down to it being very expensive to build out a lot of fiber optic equipment over long distances, especially if you're only going to reach a handful of customers. It's a lot of capital investment without much return, and the cost has been so great, in fact, that the FCC had to launch a federally funded program, the Universal Service Fund, to subsidize broadband builds in these areas. Now, there's a lot of historical data I could give you about this program, but all I'd like you to remember for now is that the USF, the Universal Service Fund, is made up of 4 programs, all dedicated to helping rural broadband expansion. There's the Lifeline Fund that provides a monthly stipend for low-income families to subsidize broadband service. There's funds to help schools, libraries, and healthcare providers have access to broadband service. But the one with the most impact, and the one we'll be talking about mostly today, is the Connect America Fund, or CAF, which promotes broadband construction. Now that you've got a better understanding of rural broadband, we can dive into the issue that's confronting us today. The CAF program has been operating for several years now. It's finished the second phase of the program, and the FCC is reporting general success. They've awarded over 170,000 census blocks to both large telco providers such as Verizon and AT&T, to small co-op providers to build out service, and dispense more than $2 billion in funding. Yet people are far from happy with the results. There's been a number of issues raised with how the FCC handled the CAF program, but by far the biggest issue, however, has been with the methodology reporting process that the FCC employs, the Form 477 process. Every 6 months, the FCC requires broadband providers to submit shapefiles listing their broadband coverage on a census block level, including the maximum advertised download speed and type of technology that they're using, the copper, fiber, wireless, satellite, etc. To give you an idea of what this can look like, I pulled up an image on the right there from the Verizon coverage results for a location I'm sure quite a few people are familiar with on the call, the State College area. Now, the main drawback to this reporting methodology, however, is that it's a binary model. Either a census block is shaded in and covered, or it's not. And for a CB to qualify as covered, the telco provider only has to offer broadband service to one household within that block. This can lead to over-reporting issues, especially in rural areas where census blocks can be hundreds of square miles, as opposed to dense urban areas where census blocks can only be the size of a city block. Now, recently, other groups have suggested replacing the system with a new process using crowdsourced internet speed test results. These are tests performed by users to determine at what speed their internet service can download information. The FCC does already gather this data, but only to a limited degree, mostly for spot checking providers. This may seem like a reasonable alternative to the Form 477. After all, you're replacing what telco providers are self-reporting with what people are actually encountering in the field, but there's a flaw in the logic. Internet speed test data can only show you what you're currently subscribed to, not what actually may be existing in your area. After all, if there's a 100 megabyte service available on a street, but everyone who lives there has only copper-based DSL at 5 megs, you can't claim that no one is qualified for the 100 megs, simply that no one is buying it. You're also dependent on the level of testing that exists in the field. If you have a wide variety of tests to draw from, then you have an ample data set to base analysis on. But if your data pool is sparse, you risk having skewed results. As I was putting together my literature review and investigating these two methodologies, I realized that despite their flaws, combining them could still yield valuable information, especially in improving the effectiveness with which the FCC allocates funding. To test this, I took speed test data from 6 states, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Texas, and compared them geospatially to Form 477 data from those areas. I theorized that we'll be able to sort locations on a need availability quadrant chart as shown. We'll be grouping by 2 factors, availability and need. By looking at availability, that is testing whether areas have at least one wired broadband provider delivering the broadband definition of 25 megabytes per second per the FCC standard, we'll be able to identify areas that already have broadband service. With need data, though, we'll be measuring whether the speed test data value is greater than 50% of the maximum advertised download speed for the area. This will allow us to determine how much people are actually buying into the product available in the field, with the rationale being that if the maximum advertised speed for an area is, say, 100 megs, a clear fiber optic broadband solution, but the median speed test is only 3 megs, then it's clear that even if people have an optimal solution, they're not taking advantage of it. These areas do not need further CAF expansion dollars, but they may be in need of further lifeline funding or educational efforts to promote broadband adoption. Diving into the chart a little further, we can see the different regions and what each means. Now, region 1, our low need, low availability. This is areas that have, there's low broadband availability here, and it would not be considered a high priority for build funding since subscription demand is not high. People are not willing to purchase even half of what speeds are available in this area. And now, before further investment should be made to this region, the FCC should determine what is keeping people from subscribing. The priority ranking for this quadrant would be considered low, with a caveat that more research is needed before a full capital investment can be recommended. Now, region 2, low need, high availability, the blue region here. Here's a unique situation. There is broadband available in this area, but the median subscription speed is lagging far behind what is offered. Why is this so? Are these areas that were awarded in phase 1 or phase 2 of CAF and service hasn't fully been built out yet? Are these areas in economically depressed regions and may benefit from additional lifeline funding? Are citizens in these regions not educated on the benefits broadband service can provide? Now, until these questions can be answered, the regions in this quadrant should be rated as low bill funding as well, although they may be a high priority for educational or lifeline funding. Region 3, the high need, low availability, areas in this quadrant would be considered high bill priority for the FCC. These are target areas for rural broadband investment. There's clearly a high demand for additional internet service here, and all efforts should be made to encourage broadband growth. Region 4, finally, is our high need, high availability. Areas in this quadrant would be considered as finished or no further funding needed. These are areas where broadband is now available and the demand is not high, which will encourage private commercial investment. There's no need for further FCC involvement in this area. Now, to give you kind of an idea of my methodology, I need to gather both the need and availability data. Availability was somewhat easy. It comes from the Form 477 FCC shapefiles, gathering the latest 2018, latest at the time, I should say, 2018 metadata that was available to me. This was joined to the census block map and then sorted through Alteryx to determine which of the census blocks had broadband wireline service, as well as which census blocks were considered rural by the census definition. It's important to note that I considered only a wired internet provider offering 25 megabytes per second down and 3 megs up as a true broadband provider, as well as excluding all satellite offerings, which have high latency and connection issues. For need, however, I needed to determine the median customer reported speeds for each census block. For that, I turned to MLab, a third-party data provider. I focused on a complete poll of all 2018 speed test results, gathering more than 25 million distinct tests and sorting them through Alteryx and Postgres to gather the median speed for each occupied census block. Then through Postgres scripting, I was able to combine the need and availability data with the census block tables and rank them into the correct quadrants. Now, before I began, I theorized that my preliminary results would resemble the following chart, with 60% of the occupied census blocks falling into the low availability, high need chart, areas that are prime candidates for CAF funding. Next, I felt that low need, high availability would be second, highlighting areas in need of additional FCC educational dollars. However, that's not what I ran into. Looking at the results, however, we can see that there was a great deal different from what I expected. In every state that I tested, The quadrant with the greatest matches was in fact the high availability, low need section. That's areas that have access to broadband, but the median speed is less than half of what is available. Even looking at rural only census blocks, this was consistent. Coming in second was our low availability, low need, followed by low availability, high need. You can see the results here on the next few slides. So what does this tell us? The first conclusion is that we can draw is that the CAF is working. After all, there are fewer and fewer spots in the country that don't have access to service. They haven't completely covered the map yet, but they are on their way. As a part of that, we can observe that subscription concerns have replaced or are in the process of replacing availability concerns in these states. What do I mean by that, and why is that important? Well, put yourself in the place of the FCC. In the past, if residents of an area didn't have broadband service, then the reason was more likely due to there not being broadband available for purchase in the first place. After all, a customer can't buy the service if it isn't there. That's an availability concern, and why CAF program was created, to promote growth and shrink those areas. Now, however, the service is there, but people are barely taking advantage of it. That's a subscription concern. Now, in the past, the FCC has considered those concerns not in their mandate. They're there, they've stated in the past, to build out the service. It's up to the customers and to the providers to reach a market level and get subscribers. However, the FCC, I believe, should investigate these areas that fall into this need gap and determine why people aren't taking advantage of the service, especially in regions where they've already invested billions of taxpayer dollars through CAF. Why? Well, very simply because they're about to invest billions more. The FCC has just announced a $9 billion program to roll out 5G service to rural America. The goal is to provide the latest technology to everyone in the country, which, it's important to note, was the same goal as CAF. Now, there's a lot of criticism going around 5G and why it may not be the answer in rural areas, but that's really not the focus of my project. What I'm trying to do is help the FCC determine where best to invest their funds in order to get maximum return. As we can see from the results, the answer isn't necessarily building more coverage than areas that aren't simply buying the service. Now, looking back over my capstone project, the biggest lesson I picked up is that MLab data alone may not be enough to provide a full coverage of the data points. For all 6 states, I was able to pull in, as I said, over 25 million speed test results. But when overlaying that with the census block records, this accounted for only 1% of the census blocks for each state being occupied. Now, this has a lot to do with how population centers are clustered. And again, since this is MLab, we're relying on outside participation. But still, I would have liked to get wider coverage. Now, going forward, either additional efforts would be needed to get people more involved with the speed test study, or I'd have to look at additional third-party data providers to see if I can get similar speed test results from them. Now, looking over at next steps for this project, there are several steps I would like to take to expand further on my analysis. Firstly, I would like to see how this data charts over time, looking at 2019 and especially 2020 data. One of the interesting side effects of the COVID lockdown has been increased rates of adoption in broadband service. I have a suspicion that my quadrant grouping would be very different with 2020 speed test results. However, those won't be available until starting in the late 2021 timeframe, especially with the Form 477 records. Secondly, my belief is that one of the contributing factors to the poor adoption rates in rural areas is probably due to economic concerns. I'd like to explore and expand adding economic rankings into the chart as well, looking at how well the high availability, low need aligns with poor median household income areas. I theorize that adding in socioeconomic data to the map will lead to increased understanding as to what factors need to be addressed in order to increase adoption rates. But frankly, finally, I would like to present this data to my FCC contacts in order to guide further efforts with rural broadband. with the FCC taking a renewed push towards rural broadband with 5G, this is the right time to bring this data to their attention. They may be able to get far more success without spending billions if they adjust their approach to areas where they may have coverage but have severely limited adoption rates. And then let me show I have a dashboard I put together containing the census blocks for each state, giving you an idea of the breakdown, how each census block corresponds, showing which is the high, this one, for example, is the high education priority, the rural status, the maximum download speed, the median value. All right. And then I'd like to open the floor up to any questions as well. Oh, I have to take a look at that. It sounds very interesting. Yeah, the ACS is a great resource for some of the census data. And that would be the first place I would turn to for some of the socioeconomic values to apply at the census block level to this.
Okay, great job. Thank you very much, Peter. We're gonna pause here for a minute because Anthony is coming back in. He's actually gonna share Leah's presentation with us so that everybody can listen to that. So if you can hang in for another 15 minutes or 20 minutes, we'd really appreciate it since she was on the schedule to begin with anyway. Anthony's gonna give me this link. And while I share that, this is just a reminder that these aren't the only presentations we have this week. We have some 596 presentations that are happening Thursday and Friday of this week and Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. I'll be sending an email about those, but just to realize the distinction that these were the final presentations for students who are graduating, and those are going to be the capstone proposals, the 596A part. So expect that email from me, and we'd love it if you could join us for those. And just hold on one more second here. Anthony's going to upload. Yeah, thanks for everybody's patience. Anthony has done a great job to make this a little bit louder. We were just having trouble hearing it. So it should just be here in a minute. Okay, so here's the link. So Anthony, what's the best way just for me to open it in YouTube and share it through Zoom? Let me try that. Oh, I hate how the Zoom chat does not let me. There. Okay. I am going to share my screen here. Yeah, Anthony, if you could try it. For some reason, I'm having a little trouble here.
The final capstone project was. Good day, everyone. The final capstone project was to develop Caribbean's electrical transmission risk analysis web map. Throughout this presentation, I will go over in detail why this web map development is important and is needed for ability to have an open source platform. Here is the overview outline of this presentation, where I will mainly go over the goals and objectives, in addition to answering how this will improve, the methodology of the development, the explanation of the full demo of the result of the web design, and lastly, the discussion about the deliverable results towards the actual output results and the potential target audience. In my work experience, the process to mitigating damages and outages after a harsh weather event can be a high-energy, chaotic process. It is usually done by gathering customer feedback on potential outage location from a dispatch group to allow general employees, such as myself, to travel towards that designated location to provide damage assessment and prepare a method to quickly fix the issue. When reviewing multiple of articles about the harsh natural disaster effects towards electrical grids in the Caribbean territories, such as Puerto Rico, I learned about the lack of access to a strong combination of spatial analysis in a singular location. This understanding created inspiration towards fixing the gap in the data availability. After reviewing the background information, the definition of the goals focused on the completed development of the interactive web map for the Caribbean islands and the surrounding areas. Due to the large-scale type idea, the immediate goal for this capstone was to build the initial web map display that requires the data source and the basic planning function. This includes the designated target site locations, meaning the countries in the Caribbean territories. The current sample is Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In addition, the standard electrical grid dataset and the standard natural disaster dataset. An additional goal is to maintain the process of development to only utilize open source type products via software or data collection. The future goal for this type of capstone project is to provide additions towards spatial analysis information into the web map, such as a hotspot analysis to risk assessment. Now that we established the goals and objectives, here are the list of definitions of some terminologies that will potentially be used throughout the presentation. To briefly go over the few terminologies, TRN stands for Electric Transmission System. FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FERC stands for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. UCOR stands for the Organization of Caribbean Utility Regulator. Genie is a free lightweight text editor. CodePen is a civil development environmental which allows to write and share code into a browser. QGIS stands for Quantum QGIS. It is an open source GIS program. And the Esri JavaScript API is an application program. Going back to the outline, the next topic to discuss is how will this improve, as in how this development will be beneficial in promoting information about the utility data relationships with natural disasters. The current availability of this type of web map consists of multiple limitations due to the separate entities of the electrical transmission grid system, the focus on Caribbean island territories, and the natural disaster dataset. The idea for improvement is to provide a platform that combines the three components together with a potential of expansion towards spatial analysis information. The official methodology of development consists of 5 main phases, which are the planning of the design and data requirements, the data collection and organization from external free sources. The web map development consists of the preliminary version and the official version. The testing phase consisting of a self-testing and a peer review testing by a utility worker that may understand the subjects. Lastly, the execution of the final project, which consists of uploading the web map into the CodePen open source server. The data collection is based on gathering data set from an open source repository location. The location of the target site location, Caribbean countries, is gathered from the Esri ArcGIS feature server. The location of the electrical grid dataset is gathered from the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data. The location for the natural disaster dataset is gathered from the National Hurricane Center from the NOAA website and the USGS Earthquake Hazard Program for real-time. The software used to develop the web map are free open source programs, QGIS and Genie. The QGIS is a free open source cross-platform desktop GIS application that, with its ability to view, edit, and analyze geospatial data, it can set up the required datasets. Genie is a free open source programmer's text editor software that assists with the workflow process. The server used to present the web map into a browser is CodePen. CodePen is an online community for testing and showcasing user-created HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code snippets. The purpose of utilizing only open source programs is to allow future users and developers to use this platform and potentially improve upon this concept. Here is the overview of the web map. It consists of several sections, which are the instructions and objectives section, the map viewer section consisting of the layer list and legend, which details the viewability and description of the data layer for the map display, The detail info, which provides attribute filters of the electric transmission line and substation attribute categories. The table info, which contains the name of the country and population count. The chart info, which is a filter histogram of the past tornado events and the past hurricane/cyclone events. The reference to the different data layer information and sources, and a how-to guide section, which is about setting up own data to a web map application. Here are the web app function examples. The first is the add shapefile, which requires a shapefile that is zipped for the application to function. The second is the base map gallery based on the Esri API list. The third is the search demo based on the Esri API setup. The fourth is the print function based on the Esri API geoprocessor setup. Here are the data analysis examples. The first is the filter, which focuses on the utility data. The second is the feature table, which focuses on the target site locations. The third is the chart histogram filter, which focuses on the historical natural disasters. The benefit of using CodePen as the open source server is utilizing the export to zip file function. The output delivery goal is to upload an official development of an interactive web map to an open source server. That server was CodePen. This is a pilot version of the web map with a completed electrical grid dataset for 2 Caribbean site territories, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is dependent based on the available access to the overall grid data of the designated territories. The web map provides a solid open source setup platform, so it has the ability to potentially be updated to the future with the goals to provide additional functions such as damage analysis or a crowdsourced documentation of outages based on a form survey submission. But that future goal extends beyond this capstone project. The target audience are potentially the UCOR, FEMA, Red Cross, emergency response organizations, or general utility companies. Lastly, the potential benefit for this web map development is to provide access to a quicker comparison towards the status of a Caribbean territory's electrical grid durability towards natural disasters. In addition, the ability to provide a formal example of how a web app application can be created and implemented is useful for any potential programmers interested in this topic. Finally, I'd like to take the time to thank my advisor for her assistance during the development of this presentation. It was much appreciated. Here are the list of resources about the background information and the definitions from this project. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Great job. That was much easier to hear thanks to Anthony. Does anybody have any questions for Leah? There's a question from Ryan.
Right. Which part was the challenging to work with? The most challenging part was just finding a server location to put all the information. Like the primary build of the web application was using the Genie, since it's an easy platform, and I get to see the examples like of what it would look like in easy fashion. But once I put it on CodePen, the main issue was getting the layout. Sometimes the layout doesn't always compute the same, so it was just more of like a slight edit. But the actual like software use was roughly simple. It wasn't much of a challenge. It was just finding a free source. All right, that was. Oh, the problem with like the I was able to like track weather events, but the power outage, that's always based on the data source available, and it was still roughly like a broad sample, since it was kind of like a pilot version. So like getting like a power outage, I would need to find something more of a specialized data. So they couldn't find a comparison. And next one was from the CodePen. Yes, I learned about CodePen in like one of the PSU classes when we work on the web application, and I just learned that it's a good source for just like a online community development, because you get to see other programmers' code and the actual format of the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript. I'll look into the
Okay.
music one.
Yeah, I think that's all. Great job, Leah. Thanks again, everybody, for hanging in here. If anybody wants to go over to Slack and ask more questions, there's a few people in there. We're going to try to start doing that more often, just because a lot of times there's more questions than we can handle in the allotted time. So it's kind of a nice way to continue the conversation, and we'll be trying to use that in various different ways. But yeah, great job to everybody. Good luck or congratulations on being close to graduation. That's fantastic. And I will be sending everybody some more emails about some 596A presentations. So we would love to have you there as well. So the first session, the first group of those will be Thursday evening. So thanks all. Have a great rest of your day.